What's going on, guys? This is the Leafs Convo podcast for Vanguard Northeast Realty in Scarborough, vanguardne.ca. I'm Norman James, along with Mike Jello. Mr. A, are you pumped up for Toronto-Cleveland? And I'm not talking about basketball. I'm talking about the second round of the AHL Calder Cup playoffs. You ready?
Good morning, Norman. I'm always ready for playoff hockey, which, usually means Marlies after the second or third week of April. And I think that the Marlies this year and players' development with the Marlies is going to be even more important because we know that a lot of these players who are on entry-level contracts are probably going to end up on the Leafs next year because of their cap constraints. So it's going to be an opportunity to have a watchful eye on the guys like Mason Marchment and Trevor Moore, obviously, and Jeremy Bracco, and see if any or all are ready to make the step into the big leagues.
Andreas Johnsson won the playoff scoring race last year, and of course the Marlies won the Calder Cup. Babcock-Keefe at the helm, and Kyle Dubas, his last real effort as the AHL general manager, going out on top. We had a feeling that Johnsson was going to be a key contributor for the Maple Leafs this season based on the fact he finished last season with the Maple Leafs and then went through that playoff against Boston. Who do you think is the Andreas Johnsson of these Calder Cup playoffs representing the Toronto Marlies?
Well, I think that of a veteran guy like Chris Mueller, who was near the top of the AHL scoring race, and Bracco, that combo is going to be very important for the Marlies going forward. I mean, they did get some replenishment from the Leafs after the Game 7 loss. They got Calle Rosen, who arguably has been their best defenseman this year. They got him back. They got Trevor Moore back, and the Leafs rolled the dice and put Michael Hutchinson on waivers. Nobody knew about it until after he had cleared, to get him back down there to help out with the goaltending. Casimir Kaskisuo played really well against Rochester, but I think if they have a realistic chance of repeating as Calder Cup champions, they're going to need Hutchinson, who we know played pretty decently in a few games with the Leafs and played really well down the stretch for the Marlies.
Do you think Leaf fans should find solace and encouragement in what they're seeing with the Marlies right now?
I think they should find encouragement because these players are going to end up, at least some of them are going to end up on the Leafs within the next 2 years. And honestly, I think that, keeping the engine going, getting young players, molding them into NHLers and moving them up to the big club is an important aspect of the Leafs going forward, because they may have three $10+ million players in Matthews, Marner, and Tavares going into training camp next year. They're going to need help. They're going to need secondary scoring, and guys like Moore, who I think proved in a small window that he's more than just a fourth liner. And other players like Bracco, who I think Bracco could be a top 9 forward in the NHL, either with the Leafs or with somebody else. They need those players while they're cheap to be able to step up and help out at the NHL level.
That glut of forwards isn't relinquishing itself at any point going forward. So you bring up a Jeremy Bracco. I'd love to see him wear the blue and white for the Toronto Maple Leafs, but you got a lot of guys, others who need to be paid. Where does Jeremy Bracco fit into the mix here, Michael? Is he potential trade bait?
He is, but the problem is, and I had a scout tell me a month or so ago, what are you going to get for Jeremy Bracco when he's unproven at the NHL level? I mean, you might be able to get a 6th or 7th defenseman. Well, that's not what the Leafs really need right now. I think their organization is strewn with 6th or 7th defensemen. They need somebody who can play 20 minutes a night, and either you're talking, Bracco as part of a larger package, or you're talking about trading somebody else who plays right wing like Nylander or Kapanen. And then Bracco moves into a top 9 role with the Leafs. Now, I've had people tell me that they don't think Bracco is ready for the NHL, that defensively he's still challenged. And that may be the case, but offensively he isn't. He's a premier passer. He's a really good playmaker. He scored over 20 goals in the American Hockey League. If you're looking just at the offensive aspect of his game, I think he's NHL ready. He may need time to mature and sort of overcook cook in the American Hockey League, but
Wow.
I think he's close to being ready.
Imagine another year if you're Camp Bracco, another year in the AHL. That can't sit too well, although they are pretty preoccupied right now with what's going on in terms of trying to win a second straight Calder Cup for the Toronto Marlies, though, Mike. Jeremy Bracco, do you see him unseating anyone? Because we talk about Trevor Moore. I'm not so sure Trevor Moore, in terms of his ceiling, is at the same level of someone like Jeremy Bracco. And then you have guys like Janssen and Kapanen and Nylander and Hyman and the list goes on. And who knows, maybe Kyle Dubas decides to trade for a rugged forward in the offseason too. Wow. I mean, it's not like it's slim pickings. It's nice to have an abundance of stuff, but you're going to have to get your ducks in a row at some point.
It's all a question of opportunity. And if you look at the left side for the Leafs next year, you'll have a 40-year-old Patrick Marleau more than likely returning, unless he decides he would either retire or waive his no move clause. Zach Hyman will probably not be available until, I would say optimistically, mid-October or maybe November with his ACL injury. So right now on the left side, you have Andreas Janssen, who's up for arbitration, and Trevor Moore. I think Mason Marchment mixes in there in terms of a size on the fourth line. But really it's sort of light on the left side right now. On the right side, you're loaded. You might be able to get a guy like Kapanen to move over, but right now I think Bracco, I don't think he can play the left side. But you're loaded with Marner, Kapanen, Connor Brown, who could flip over to the left side. And Bracco fits in there. So I mean, it might be a situation where, I mean, Kyle Dubas, we don't know what the landscape is going to be. We don't know right now who is going to be back of that group. I mean, very easily Nylander can be traded. Very easily Kapanen could be traded. Everything is in flux right now. So to say whether Bracco has an opportunity or whether Bracco will even be back, nobody knows.
This is the Leafs Convo podcast for Vanguard Northeast Realty in Scarborough, vanguardne.ca. I feel like the experience the Marlies got last year and the fact there's still a ton of talent down there gives this group a good opportunity to repeat as Calder Cup champion. I'm not so sure what the chronology of champions looks like going back, but to go back to back in the AHL would be pretty significant. Now, I'm not handing them the title by any means. However, they're into the second round. They've got good players. They've got that experience. Sheldon Keefe is still the coach. Maybe this is his last go in Toronto, period. Maybe this is his last go before he takes over for Mike Babcock. Seems like a fun run.
Well, they dodged a bullet in their opponent in the second round. Not to say that Cleveland is going to be an easy out, but I think they're a less fearful opponent than Syracuse. I mean, Syracuse is Tampa Bay's minor league team. They played them 2 years in a row. They've both been tough contests. They're a loaded organization in terms of talent. Cleveland is good, but they're not as good as Syracuse. So the Marlies benefited, and if they can take out Cleveland, I honestly don't know who is coming out of the other part of the Eastern Conference. But there's a chance. I mean, with Hutchinson back in goal, their defense is pretty sound. You have AHL guys who were on that Calder Cup winning team last year. Veteran guys like Colin Greening and Chris Mueller to supplement some of the young players. So there is a chance, but it would be, I don't know if it would be unprecedented, but it would be pretty close. And Sheldon Keefe, I know the speculation that's out there, the rumor about Buffalo possibly being interested in talking to him after he swept their AHL team and other teams. I find it hard to believe that Sheldon Keefe is going to go anywhere, especially with what is going on right now with the Leafs and the potentially tenuous position of Mike Babcock over the next year or two.
Didn't Paul Maurice ride out a year or two and wait for – who was the coach before Paul Maurice? It was
Pat Quinn.
Yeah, okay, Pat Quinn. So he rode out a year or two in the AHL. This is after he was head coach of the Carolina Hurricanes, taking them to a Stanley Cup final.
It was the year of the lockout. It was the canceled year, and then he stepped in as Leafs coach the next year.
Yeah, there might be a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Who knows what's going to play out this summer? I'd like to see the focus be on improving the team, but if you put a team in place that you believe is going to be productive and potentially contend for a Stanley Cup championship, but you have a head coach who is philosophically not the guy who is going to be able to employ and deploy these players in the right way, then, man, that's a major distraction. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out with Kyle Dubas. You'd think, though, Mike, if Kyle Dubas has any doubt about Mike Babcock, you'd want to get it out of the way as soon as possible, maybe even after the Marlies season concludes.
I still am doubtful that they will fire Babcock. But the thing is if they move forward, there's some talk about assistant coaches being changed. Babcock has rotated his staff in Detroit. Lots of different coaches have come in, and this has pretty much been a stagnant group since he's been in Toronto. DJ Smith may be a candidate for both Ottawa and Edmonton's head coaching jobs. So changes on his staff, but I think, and we can explore this going forward, and I'm going to write about these on Hockey Buzz, what the constitution of this team will be is going to be dramatically different if Mike Babcock is there or if Mike Babcock is not there. For example, I don't think there's a chance in hell that Garrett Sparks is the backup goaltender for the Toronto Maple Leafs next year if Mike Babcock is the coach. He simply does not trust him, and I think that there are other options out there that you can get for $800,000 to $900,000 in terms of a veteran backup that he'd have more trust in than a guy who he couldn't even trust to be sit on the bench and carry a clipboard in the playoffs.
You're right, Mike, but that belief, that feeling is not restricted to Mike Babcock. We all feel that way. And you and I were the first, right at the fore of suggesting before last season began, that Garrett Sparks was not the right choice. So we have lots of problems with Mike Babcock. Him not trusting Garrett Sparks is certainly not one of them. And speaking of Curtis McElhinney, he comes in relief of Peter Mrazek and gets the win for Carolina, now 2-up on the beloved New York Islanders. I hate to say a toe-to-toe, but a toe-to-toe, it is what it is. He's another one of those ex-Leafs still in the playoffs. And on our last podcast, you unfurled the names of ex-Leafs who are still playing like it really matters. But it's fun to track and watch and see what happens. Curtis McElhinney wasn't on that list. We forgot about him. But again, here's a guy that you'd really like to have as your backup. And Garrett Sparks didn't play any role in this 7-game series loss to the Boston Bruins, but if Curtis McElhinney were the backup during the regular season for the Leafs, maybe they get a couple of extra wins. Maybe that puts them in a better position and they don't have to face Boston. Who knows? Real quick on Curtis McElhinney, and that's a question from Joel Illman on our community platform on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/the Leafs Convo. What do you think the Leafs will do with the backup goalie position next season? You sort of answered it a few minutes ago.
Like I said, if Babcock is back, I don't think Sparks will be the backup. If Babcock is gone and it's Sheldon Keefe, who won a Calder Cup with Sparks, and Dubas, who clearly wants to promote from within, he might get another shot. I'm against it because I don't think he's an NHL goaltender. But they're going to do what they're going to do, and we just have to cover them and follow what's going on. But in terms of options, I mean, Hutchinson could be an option. I think he's been capable. They traded a 5th-round pick for him. He's a UFA. I don't think he'd be ridiculously expensive. I think he's a steady NHL backup with over 100 games of experience. And if he continues to play well with the Marlies, then he's sort of a third goaltender option. I don't think it's going to be a problem to get Garrett Sparks or Michael Hutchinson through waivers as it was McElhinney and Pickard after training camp last year. So I think that problem is sort of put to the side, and I think it makes sense that no matter who's the coach to sign a third goaltender and to have somebody who's capable of stepping in, because honestly, we saw the pitfalls of that this year.
Incredible. There's still so much to do to upgrade this team, help it get to the next level. And this head coaching, that's not controversy, but this head coaching situation prevails. It's going to prevail the entire time. Can Mike Babcock rehabilitate and revise his way of thinking, Mike, in time to not necessarily just save his job, because he'll get a job somewhere else, or save his career, but so that he can get in lockstep with the general manager, who seems to be a little bit more contemporary in his beliefs, and be the guy going forward, Mike?
I don't know if he can really compromise his methods. I mean, one thing that he can do is if he brings on assistant coaches who are more attuned to what the method of the and philosophy of the organization is, that's sort of a compromise. I mean, he has brought in experienced assistants and he's brought in young assistants in his past. So I know that the name of Paul McFarland has been mentioned over the last couple of weeks. He was an assistant coach with the Florida Panthers, specializing in the power play, former head coach of the Kingston Frontenacs. And Jeff Merrick mentioned a few weeks ago that after being let go with Bob Bugner as part of the cleaning out in Florida, that McFarland's name might be somebody that the Leafs would be interested in. He's 33 years old. He's, they had Florida with less potent personnel had the number 2 power play in the NHL. And I think that some different tactics are going to be needed to improve the Leafs special teams. And that might be the focus of what Babcock does in terms of change this offseason.
Coincidence, though, you'd be removing one Bob Bugner disciple and bringing in another, DJ Smith, obviously coaching under Bob Bugner before leaving Windsor to go to Oshawa and win his own Memorial Cup championship, carving his own path and creating his own name as a head coach in the O. And then it looks like he may get that opportunity at some point in the NHL. If you have problems with DJ Smith, replacing him with a guy who is, also a student of the Bob Bugner game will be interesting. The thing about Mike Babcock losing his assistants or changing his assistants, how much say will he get in bringing in new assistants who contemporize his philosophy against what Kyle Dubas is going to want? Go back to the Randy Carlyle era when he was stripped of his assistants and the writing was on the wall after that. It's like, you're the last man standing here. If things don't improve, you're gone. And he was eventually given the hook.
Yeah, I mean, it was, they fired Dave Farish, and they bring in Steve Spott and Peter Horacek. And, less than a year after that, Carlisle was fired. Now, I would assume that in his contract, and I have no idea because I've never seen the contract, so I don't know for sure, but based on the reputation of Babcock, I'm assuming that he has full autonomy in terms of who his assistants are. He brought in Hiller, he brought in Smith, he brought in Andrew Brewer as the video guy. I haven't seen anybody that has been brought in that hasn't had the stamp of being a Babcock guy. So I would assume that if they do hire different assistants, it's going to be Babcock that's going to make those choices. But if it is, that's why I don't think it's going to be Sheldon Keefe. Like there have been some talk that, well, Keefe could come up as an assistant. First of all, there's no benefit to him. He's already a head coaching candidate with other NHL teams right now. He doesn't need the NHL experience as an assistant. Plus, I mean, with everything that's out there right now, do you think Mike Babcock wants Sheldon Keefe beside him on the bench when he's the heir apparent? I don't think so.
Yeah, it's frustrating, Mike. It really is. Maury Zelkovich on the community platform. Were the Leafs good enough this year but simply mismanaged on the ice? Before you answer that, let me just say, there's the narrative after Game 7 especially is that Mike Babcock is out to lunch and he's old and he doesn't know what he's doing and mismanaged. That game was mismanaged, but were the Leafs good enough this year but simply mismanaged? It's just such a broad narrative that's morphed into something that is tough to take serious. It's more complex than that. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the players. If you have good enough players, you're going to win. Beating the Boston Bruins for the Maple Leafs, regardless of the coach, was too hard. There are other things going on, but I grant you, Mike Babcock didn't make himself any friends or do himself any favors with his coaching performance in Game 7.
Can you question some of the decisions that Babcock did during the series? Of course. Can you say they should have played Austin Matthews more than 18 minutes? Of course. Can the decision to play Zach Hyman on the top line with a torn ACL or the penalty kill? Of course. All those things, those are under the purview of the coach. But as I said going into the playoffs, and I picked Boston, this team was not good enough. Their defense simply was not good enough. You go into the playoffs with Nikita Zaitsev as your number 4 defenseman, who had a bad year, and he played better than expected in the playoffs, with a 60 to 65% Jake Gardiner with a bad back, and loading on minutes on a 38-year-old Ron Hainsey and playing Morgan Riley 26, 27 minutes a night. Simply, they weren't good enough on the blue line. They tightened up defensively, and they should be given credit for that. And they got to a 7th game, but they were closer to winning. They were closer to winning a 7-game series against the Bruins last year with Roman Polak, Leo Komarov, and Bozak and Van Riemsdyk than they were this year with Tavares and Muzzin. That tells you, in a way, even though they added supreme talent in those 2 guys, that the rest of the team wasn't good enough.
Yeah, fans wonder if Mike Babcock should be given one more year. I think the consensus among us, Mike, is that it looks like he's going to be given another year. Kyle Dubas may have a change of heart. I don't know if he's sat down with Brendan Shanahan, who will obviously have to be consulted in any major decision-making capacity. Eli Cohen wanted to know if Mike Babcock not being a part of a radio interview postseason was an indicator of his falling out of favor with the team, the organization, the media. Eli is a longtime listener of the podcast, so I thought I would throw that in there, Mike.
There's Leafs PR will put out the GM and the coach after the season for radio interviews. And I didn't hear Dubas either. I may have missed something, but I didn't hear Dubas on TSN 1050 or on Fan 590. So maybe they just didn't do that since, at the end of the season was so acrimonious, and maybe they're waiting a little time before they make the rounds there.
Beef Farmer 85.
Yeah.
Do you think we'll have to say goodbye to forwards like Cappy or Janssen in order to obtain a stronger D?
This all depends on, first of all, what the cap is going to be at. It could be anywhere between 83 to 85 million. Whether Kapanen and his representatives, who reportedly before the end of the season were amenable to a bridge deal. And he didn't have a strong last quarter. He ended up with 20 goals, but I think he scored 1 goal in the last 20 games, something like that, and then scored 1 goal in the playoffs. So, Kapanen slowed down a little bit. So they may want a sort of prove-it bridge deal, say, show us and you'll get the big money down the road. I think that one won't be so acrimonious. Janssen has arbitration rights and could go anywhere from $2.5 to $3 million. And that doesn't sound bad, but in the context of what they're going to have to pay Marner and what they're already paying Nylander, some moves are going to have to be made, and it's a question whether they move out Nylander, they move out one of those forwards, or they move out Kadri and Connor Brown. There's going to be moves.
What about Mitch Marner being dealt? There seems to be now, especially from fans who are really favorable to William Nylander and him becoming the number 2 to Austin Matthews, this idea that, Mitch Marner is going to be in the way because he's going to be asking for way too much money, and his camp will have not learned from the Nylander fiasco, and it's going to be pear-shaped, it's going to be ugly, it's going to be disgusting, and to avert all that, you get rid of him and bring back the King's ransom of prospects and futures that a lot of specifically Nylander fans would love to see come back to get the number 16 out of the way for number 29 to get the spotlight. Mike, you know what I'm getting at here. Are we even going to get to that point, or do you think Camp Marner, Dubas, the Leafs are going to be smart enough to get this guy signed and just move forward? Because again, with the coach and other things that need to be done to improve this team, there's a lot going on for a guy who's entering his 2nd year as Leafs general manager.
Well, I take Dubas at his word that he is making Marner priority number 1 for this offseason. That only makes sense. And I think he's learned the lessons of what happened with the Nylander situation. He let things go on too long. They were dragging their feet, hoping that they would get their money. And then in the end, they ended up getting their money. So, that the way that situation was handled, gives Darren Ferris, the agent for Mitch Marner, the sort of the ammo to go and play follow the same playbook. But the situation is, though, you have to acknowledge it because it's come out from very good reporters like Chris Johnston from Sportsnet, that the Leafs are going to. I think they're going to approach this like they approached Matthews. They realize the value of Marner. They respect him. They think he's one of the best players. They want to keep him long term, but they need to keep things on a timetable, and they need it resolved before July the 1st. And if the thing is if Ferris drags his feet like Louis Gross and Michael Nylander did, and they get close to July 1st, the Leafs may not let them use the sword of Damocles of the offer sheet as a weapon. They're going to say, okay, we've negotiated in good faith. We want to pay you. We want you to be a long-term Leaf, but you seem intent on breaking the bank. And honestly, if you do that, we can trade you and get value for you. I don't think they want to do that. I think they're making sure that it's out there and letting them know, we love you. We think you're great, but you're not an untouchable.
You know me, Mike. I love the Leafs over Leafs, and that goes for the Nylander rights. That goes for people who are all about Mitch Marner, for Austin Matthews, Morgan Riley. I'm a proponent of the team being well as opposed to a particular player being more well off than the rest, because I understand that's part of the game these days, but I don't want to see that Marner camp do something stupid and follow the blueprint of what the Nylander crew did. Yeah, they got their money ultimately. Does he deserve that kind of money? I still think we're going to find out whether or not he does. Did it hurt the team? I think it did. Will Marner and his camp in an impasse or in a struggle with the Leafs hurt this organization at a time that's very critical? You bet it will. So let's hope they're smart enough to make this thing to resolve this, to get this wrapped up in an appropriate, professional, and productive way for both sides. And think about it. For Mitch Marner, he loves the Leafs, Toronto guy, okay? You really, you want to be making 11 and a half or whatever. You really want to wake up playing for the New York Islanders or the Sabres or whichever other team you guys take the money from or you get traded to because there's just too much nonsense going on? Is that what this kid really wants? I know the parents and the organizer or his staff, his camp might want to just make as much money as possible. But your dream of playing for the Maple Leafs has happened, and you're getting closer. But because you had to go head-to-head with Kyle Dubas and make as much money as possible and throw a wrench at this team when it doesn't need any more wrenches thrown at it, the ultimate is going to be you playing on another team. I don't think Mitch Marner wants that. Just a few more things before we wrap up. Mike,
Sure.
Your impressions of the playoffs to this point, some interesting storylines, some interesting series. The Columbus-Boston series, man. I don't know if whichever team comes out of that is going to have enough gas left in the tank to deal with Carolina. I'm hoping Carolina wins. I do not want to see the Islanders get to an Eastern Conference final.
No, but it's interesting in that Columbus-Boston series what a team with physicality can do against the Bruins. Because Columbus is big. A guy like Josh Anderson is I think as close to Tom Wilson as you can get. Big, nasty, goes in the corners, lays people out. They have size. They're pushing back against the Bruins. They're playing the Bruins game, and they're winning at it. They got great goaltending from Bobrovsky in game 2. Panarin is putting on a show. I mean, again, I know that philosophically the Leafs are not going to be that sort of big bruising team, but you need to be able to play a variety of different games to win the Stanley Cup playoffs. You need to play with skill at some points. You also need to be tough at some points. And Columbus, with the addition of Duchesne and already having Panarin, and then they got big forwards like Nick Foligno and Anderson, they're able to crash and bang and put a hurt on the Bruins, and as well as stick up to them in terms of skill. So I think I picked Columbus in the series because I think the Bruins, after the series with the Leafs, they might be a little tuckered out. But I think that Columbus is sort of the blueprint for what Toronto has to face. They have to find more size and more players that play like that to be able to beat Boston or even beat Tampa, because Columbus beat Tampa playing that game as well.
Yeah, no doubt. Just a few more minutes. Look, lovers of physical hockey are not the sharpest tools in the shed, right, Mike? Because they slip on their own drool and hit their heads. And people who just want finesse, skill hockey are afraid of their own shadow, so they're really not watching the game because they're scared. Why can't physicality, tough hockey coalesce with skill? Why not? It can. So this idea that it's one or the other, to me, it's just so narrow-minded and closed-minded. I think Kyle Dubas is going to understand that you can't just build a team one way and think that that team's going to run through the playoffs, because you're going to run into a matchup that just doesn't work for you. Toughness, physicality, skill, finesse, amazing hockey can coagulates into one big amazing thing called a team that's going to go all the way and win a Stanley Cup.
Yeah, I look at hockey like, and remember, in my earlier life I was educated to be a teacher. I look at hockey the way teachers look at educating students. It's not just one way. It's got to be a variety of ways to reach everyone. And the way you do that is, okay, teams need speed. Teams need skill. They also need size and sandpaper and toughness. You have to be able to play a variety of different games. You can't just approach it one way. And I think that's, I think Kyle Dubas is a smart guy. I think he realizes that. I think that you will see this team over the next few years address that, because he can't ignore the evidence that this team in certain times gets pushed around. I'm not saying they need goons. I'm saying they need size, and they need to push back against teams that try to take out skilled players. And that's what, the Bruins did. How did Mitch Marner play after Zdeno Chara pancaked him at the beginning of Game 4? He almost disappeared.
No,
that has an effect.
Yeah. Well, it did have an effect. It certainly did. Okay, Mike, before we wrap up, the three major things the Leafs need to get done, complete, and be satisfied with in this offseason. 1, deal with Marner. 2, bring in a defenseman. 3, figure out the head coaching situation.
I think they have to decide on what they're going to do with Babcock immediately in the next week or two, because if you're, I think your decisions in terms of roster makeup, in terms of philosophy, are going to stem from that. So first things first, on similar tracks at the same time, work on getting Marner's new contract and decide what direction you're going with the coach. If you're going with Babcock, then maybe some reorganization of his assistants, but you're pretty much going down the same track. But they have to work on Marner and get him signed, I would say, before the end of the Stanley Cup final. Don't push it to late June when the draft comes along, because then all that's going to be going on is speculation about trade and offer sheet. After that, I think third, but equally as important, is figure out who is going to be gone, who is going to stay, and go in the direction of improving your defense and getting other players signed on contracts. This is going to be a very fluid summer. I think one thing you'll see is that I think Dubas will be looking for guys like Tyler Ennis, cheap one-year contracts that he can bring in to supplement. And this is a team with a lot of scoring, and Ennis is probably going to go someplace else and make a lot more money after scoring 12 goals as a fourth liner in Toronto. And there'll be other guys out there that'll say, this is my opportunity to bounce back and have a good year and then sell myself on the open market the following year, so they can benefit from bringing in some veteran guys on short-term deals.
Michael, it's been fun. Have a good one. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Norm.